Destroy your enemy from within with the Scholar, sinking terrifying amounts of damage silently throughout the entire enemy team while crippling their ability to recover. The Scholar is a master of resource devastation. Scholar provides their team with a powerful combat sprint, allowing them to masterfully cruise across the battlefield while skyrocketing their damage through catalyze. But when pushed into a corner, the Scholar calls upon Seraph to bathe their entire field in shields and heals as the single most powerful healing ultimate in the entire game. Now, if that isn't the same thing as divine intervention to your team, I don't know what is. With that elevator pitch out of the way, let's get into the details. So Scholar's basic spammable is, to everyone's surprise, Broil. Shocking, I know. Just remember that you can weave in recuperate heals and other OGCD abilities because you do have that weave window. Much more interesting is Biolysis, which is an instant cast damage over time effect that ticks for 3000 damage for a total damage potency of 15,000 at baseline. Biolysis also has the effect that the target deals 10% less damage, significantly helping your team to survive. This effect can also be refreshed and kept up almost infinitely because its cooldown is 15 seconds, which matches the 15-second duration of the debuff. So timed properly, this can be out constantly. But I think this ability, much like the damage and how effective it can be, is a little deceptive here. So let's talk about this damage for a bit and why it's actually scary, even though many damage sources do technically do more. This is actually a critical point for the Scholar because this is where it starts to really deviate. So for a single button press at range with no cast time, you basically guarantee 15k damage sunk into that target, which is something that keeps on going even if they shield, even if they move out of range, even if they try and use walls. Essentially, this robs them guaranteed of one recuperate charge. Now let's talk about how to augment this ability to make it even scarier. And so Scholar gets the status effect Recitation through two sources that we're going to talk about more later, either through their ultimate or through using Expedient. Recitation makes this hit 50% more damage, and so now you demand over the next 15 seconds them to use at least recuperate and a half. Now the second augment that makes this even scarier than that somehow is that the Scholar gets deployment tactics, which allows them to spread this damage over time effect and its 10% damage reduction across the entire enemy team with its large 15-yard radius. So now you have a persistently ticking damage over time effect across the entire enemy team, which I have used very often to top the damage charts, which is extremely powerful in and of its own right on that. The 10% damage reduction though, however, is extremely super incredibly significant though. This reduces the burst that your team takes, allowing for easier recovery from, say, a Dragoon or White Mage burst combo, or better recuperate spam for your team if they're choosing to go at a less bursty approach. Regardless of how you slice it, it's a very powerful effect. Now with Biolysis out of the way, let's make this even scarier with a completely separate ability called Mummification. This ability is not as burst prone as a Silence or a Stun or White Mage's Polymorph, which are no doubt very powerful. But instead, the Scholar with this ability is a little bit more subtle, a little bit more insidious. Many stuns and silences were nerfed to 2 seconds like the White Mage Ultimate or Red Mage's Silence. Mummification, however, is a 25% healing reduction, which is very significant, that lasts 10 seconds on a 20-second cooldown timer that can be applied even when the target has guard. So similar to damage over time effects, while this isn't bursty, you will also struggle to escape it, or rather your enemies will. Say you have an enemy in guard at low health, Biolysis them, and then use this Mummification ability, and their ability to recover from that guard absolutely tanks. It's most likely that you're going to secure it. In many PvP games like Overwatch, we have the idea of being staggered, where you can't go for a full 5 versus 5 team fight because one person got staggered, they got knocked out, and now you need to wait for them. One of the most powerful things is that if someone's just trying to guard the payload and they think that they can just recuperate spam or just heal it off and just survive it and really delay you, is, as a Scholar, you completely wreck that idea. Don't try and do this against a Scholar if you aren't playing Scholar. Now more about this isn't even mentioning that it has an 8-yard radius, allowing it to be applied to multiple targets in a team fight, which if you have this and your other effects out, causes a metric ton of pressure to their MP. It makes it harder for them to mash recuperate. That seems to be honestly a very much used strategy. It's just extremely hard for them to keep up their HP, especially when focused. 25% less healing from that means that there's less of a chance that they'll be able to survive a more intense amount of damage, just because they cannot get their HP high enough to that threshold. Now let's talk about Adloquium, which is going to be an instant cast barrier. Nice, in PvP it is instant cast, as well as a heal that means less chance to overheal and quality of life, casting this on yourself or an ally being focused to help improve their prognosis. or well, since we're not playing Sage, we'll just say chances of living. Now I mentioned recitation before for Biolysis, which comes from Expedient or the ultimate. That recitation, however, can also be spent on Adloquium, which turns it into a 10% damage boost for 15 seconds. These effects, similar to Biolysis, can spread across your entire party. As you can well imagine, it's nice to have that effect. Now to be clear, I actually do not recommend wasting deployment tactics on an unbuffed Adlo. The tiny 4k shield is, to be quite frank, very, very tiny and insignificant. You only really want to spread the buff really. So spreading Biolysis, though, I do want to be clear, with its damage ticking and its damage down debuff is always going to be fantastic, always going to be viable. But spreading Adlo without the 10% damage buff for your team through recitation Adlo is not worth wasting the charge of deployment tactics on. Now the real pinch worth talking about here is recitation outside of limit break is tied to Expedient, which means that only every second Biolysis or every second Adlo can be buffed since it is at a 30-second cooldown. But without ultimate charge, it becomes a decision process. You really need to choose which one of these you will buff during that 30-second window. Generally speaking, if my team has some great damage going out and the flow feels right to burst the enemy team down, I go Adlo with recitation to improve that burst. But if my team doesn't feel as bursty and I think the team might have more, maybe more burst, maybe I'm suspecting a white mage ult, maybe a dragoon ult, I will go Biolysis. Of course, if you have limit break, you can use both, and that obviously applies so much more pressure to the enemy team, it's ridiculous, but we're talking about when you don't have limit break there. But now let's talk about Expedient, which does a lot more than just apply recitation. It also gives 10 seconds of increased movement speed to the party, as well as 10% damage mitigation. With any team comp, but especially melee, this is going to be outstanding. But definitely, even if you're mostly range, this is still very, very strong. It allows a little bit more kiting, a little bit more wall maneuver. Definitely don't turn your nose up at that. 10% damage mitigation for your team also does work very well, as you might imagine, with the 10% damage reduction debuff that you put on the enemies being roughly 10% less damage taken by your team, 10% less damage put out from the enemies. That's going to be roughly a 20% less damage that your team takes effect. As you can well imagine, I've already flipped off many white mages I suspected would limit break in an attempt to burst us during this combo, but that's a lot of mitigation, and so many of them actually stood still after their combo didn't wipe us, as my team survived that burst combo. But yes, I do want to be clear, samurais are still a problem, but not every team is running samurai, so you can definitely chew up a lot of these burst combos with these two. Biolysis with Expedient, very strong. Now this brings us to our final ability, which is the single most powerful healing ultimate in PvP, period. Seraph. Nothing comes even remotely close to what this button can pump out, not even in the same dimension. In fact, I have single-handedly turned around overtime team fights with this ability. So first off, another recitation obviously allows you to deploy both buffed Biolysis as well as buffed Adlo, which is brutal. That is a ton of pressure that you are instantly applying during a team fight. But this does hinge on you sitting on 2 charges of deployment tactics or one coming up pretty quickly after. Now you bring out Seraph that instantly applies 2 effects to the entire party. The first of all is going to be Seraphic Flight, which will remove the next status effect, not the current one, the next status effect, so something like Bard's Wanderer's Minuet, as well as Excogitation, which is going to be a burst of 8,000 potency of healing when a target's health goes below 50% per individual party member. Obviously, this is not going to be like one party member goes below 50% or one party member gets it. It's on an individual basis, which makes this very, very strong. To say the least. Obviously a burst heal at that time to reduce overheal, to ensure that they live, is going to be fantastic. But during this you also have Consolation, which is another button that you can press, which applies an 8,000 healing potency divided between barrier and heal to party. 50-50 split between healing and shield is always something I've liked. That's why I've gravitated to barrier healers in PvE as well as PvP, I guess, since it reduces the overheal that you will get, so you get at least something on your teammates, even if they are at full HP when you pull out Seraph. At least you'll get that shield. During a team fight, eventually they'll get hit, it'll mitigate something, it at least does something. That same idea really extends to Seraphic Veil, where Seraph is basically going to just spit out Seraphic Veil all over the place. Like, it's going to be really awesome, and Seraph even does cast it when you're at full health for the shield, at least as I can show in this footage. Very, very, very powerful. Which brings us to the end of this PvP guide for the Scholar. To say the absolute least, what Scholar does not do in Burst, it makes up for in a tidal wave of status effects and consistent pressure. It debilitates enemies, buffs allies to the heavens. Mind you, I can't say that it has good burst when it has Seraph that is that crazy of an ultimate healing ability. my point is, it's wild, and I really think that people should give Scholar a chance because, oh my god, I've been playing it so much lately, and with those new buffs, it just flows so nicely. Don't overlook the Scholar. It's definitely worth your time.
Cat Daddy, that subscribe button, please.
I'm joking.